Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating and honestly highly consequential geopolitical journey. We're going to track India's counterterrorism doctrine, specifically looking at how it fundamentally evolved over the course of nearly 2 decades, from 2001 to 2019. It's really a story of how a nation shifted its entire strategic posture, moving away from a policy of profound restraint to one of very proactive, hard-powered deterrence. All right, let's just dive right into this.
To truly wrap our heads around the events we're about to unpack, we actually have to start with a massive central dilemma. Picture this. How exactly does a democracy compel a nuclear-armed neighbor to dismantle terrorist infrastructure without accidentally triggering a full-scale conventional war? I mean, this is the ultimate tightrope walk, right? It's the exact question that haunted Indian policymakers for 20 years. If you push too softly, well, the attacks just keep coming. But if you push too hard, you risk an unthinkable nuclear exchange. So, keep that incredibly delicate balancing act in mind, because it's going to frame our entire analysis today.
Now, before we get into the timeline, we gotta lay down some groundwork. What do we actually mean by cross-border terrorism? Well, it's not just a random act of violence. It is the deliberate use of non-state armed actors operating from the territory of one state to conduct operations against another. And based on our source material, India has faced this persistently from Pakistan-based militant organizations, specifically groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba. These groups have documented links to the Pakistani state apparatus, which, makes this a deeply, deeply complex international security challenge.
So, here's our game plan for today. First, we'll look at the security challenge, then the era of restraint, the doctrine shifts, the Balakot threshold, and finally, the escalation ladder.
All right, let's step back in time to the early 2000s with Section 1, the security challenge, and the era of restraint. Let's wind the clock back a bit and compare two of the most devastating attacks in modern Indian history. Back in 2001, the Indian Parliament, literally the citadel of its democracy, was attacked jointly by GEM and LET operatives. 9 security personnel tragically died defending the building. Fast forward 7 years, and you have the 2008 Mumbai attacks. Executed by LET, this one targeted civilians, luxury hotels, and a busy railway station, resulting in a staggering 166 deaths. Despite the completely different targets, the common thread here is undeniable. Both operations were executed by Pakistan-based militant networks.
Now, those 2008 Mumbai attacks, which are universally known as 2611, they were just entirely overwhelming. We're not talking about a single blast here. This was a multi-day, multi-site urban siege. On November 26th, 10 heavily armed terrorists basically arrived by sea, split up, and launched simultaneous coordinated assaults. For the next 3 days, hostages were held at iconic locations like the Taj Mahal Palace Hotel. It wasn't until November 29th that India's elite National Security Guard finally managed to secure the Taj. This unprecedented, highly decentralized attack completely overwhelmed the initial, localized security response.
A system failure of that sheer magnitude? Yeah, it forced a massive reckoning. The scale of the carnage in Mumbai necessitated a complete internal overhaul of India's counterterrorism architecture. India ended up creating its very first federal counterterrorism police force, the National Investigation Agency, or NIA. They tightened their anti-terror laws significantly through the UAPA. And, to make absolutely sure their elite forces wouldn't ever face critical travel delays again, they established NSG regional hubs across the entire country and completely restructured their coastal security grid.
And this right here is where we really see the essence of what's called the era of restraint. In 2001, India launched Operation Parakram, literally mobilizing 500,000 troops to the border. It was a hugely coercive posture, but one that deliberately stopped just short of war. Then in 2008, despite a much higher casualty count, the response was actually even more restrained. India presented diplomatic dossiers packed with evidence. They engaged the international community, and they pursued strictly legal action, most notably capturing and trying the lone surviving terrorist, Ajmal Kasab. But in both of these instances, despite the absolute devastation, India did not cross the border to retaliate militarily.
But, geopolitics rarely stay static. That brings us to Section 2, the doctrine shifts.
This shift really kicks off with some crucial context. In late December 2015, India's Prime Minister made a total surprise, unannounced visit to Lahore to meet his Pakistani counterpart. It was a massive diplomatic olive branch. But barely a week later, on January 2, 2016, Jaish-e militants attacked the Pathankot Air Force Base in Punjab. And this established a really grim theme.
militant groups deliberately executing attacks to torpedo and sabotage literally any diplomatic momentum between the two nations.
And then, later that year, in September 2016, we hit an absolute breaking point: 19. That's the number of Indian Army soldiers killed in action during the Uri attack. Heavily armed terrorists managed to infiltrate a forward brigade headquarters near the line of control while the soldiers were sleeping. It was the highest single incident loss for the army in Jammu and Kashmir in 20 years. That horrific toll pushed both the public and the political threshold in India way past the point of return. The old playbook of restraint, it just wasn't viable anymore.
So how did this translate into action? Well, the response to Uri was a total watershed moment. Following the attack, Indian special forces actually crossed the line of control into Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. They systematically targeted and destroyed several terrorist launch pads, but here is the absolutely crucial part. India publicly announced the strikes. A senior military official literally went on television to confirm it. Openly acknowledging a cross-border raid like that was a decisive, completely unambiguous break from the historical era of strategic restraint.
This entirely new posture set the stage for 2019, moving us into Section 3, the Balakot threshold.
200 kilograms. Let that sink in. That is an absolutely massive amount of high-grade military explosive, specifically RDX. In February 2019, a 19-year-old JM recruit packed all of that into a vehicle and rammed it directly into a security convoy on a highway in Pulwama. It was a suicide car bomb, a tactic you usually see in places like Syria or Iraq, not here. The catastrophic explosion killed 40 CRPF Jawans instantly. The sheer brutality of the Pulwama attack demanded a response that would, once again, completely rewrite the strategic rules of the region.
And rewrite the rules they absolutely did. Just 12 days after Pulwama, Indian Air Force Mirage 2000 jets crossed the line of control. But they didn't just strike near the border. They hit a GEM training camp in Balakot, deep within the Pakistani mainland. This was historically massive. It was the first time since the 1971 war that India used offensive air power on Pakistani soil proper. Pakistan retaliated the very next day, which led to intense aerial combat where an Indian pilot was actually shot down and captured. Fortunately, under some very heavy international pressure, the pilot was returned unharmed, de-escalating what was arguably the most dangerous moment between the two nuclear rivals in 2 decades.
So, how do we make sense of this entire journey? Let's transition to Section 4, the escalation ladder.
When you actually lay these events out side by side, chronologically, you see a literal, step-by-step escalation of India's military response. Back in 2001 and 2008, we saw troop mobilizations and heavy diplomacy. Then, by 2016, with Pathankot and Uri, we start seeing intense UN pressure, followed by covert but publicly acknowledged ground special operations across the border. And finally, in 2019 with Pulwama, the response jumps all the way up to overt mainland airstrikes. It is just a textbook example of a nation actively climbing the escalation ladder to enforce its security.
This climb up the ladder brings us to a fundamentally new doctrinal reality. By 2019, strategic restraint was officially out and proactive deterrence was in. What is that? Well, it's the principle that the costs of sponsoring terrorism will deliberately escalate to levels the sponsoring state's military and political establishment simply cannot afford. It's no longer just about absorbing a blow and tightening up your internal security. It's about guaranteeing a punishing, disproportionate response to deter any future attacks.
But listen, military strategy doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? It's driven by the people. The source material points out that this escalatory trajectory reflects a growing domestic consensus in India for harder, far more visible responses to mass casualty terrorist attacks. It really highlights how domestic politics, raw public outrage, and this undeniable demand for accountability fundamentally reshape the nation's entire foreign policy and counter-terrorism posture.
Which leaves us with one incredibly vital question to ponder. What does this transition to proactive deterrence actually mean for the future of subconventional warfare between nuclear rivals? India has very clearly drawn a new line in the sand, showing they are fully willing to use hard military force to stop cross-border terrorism. But with both of these nations possessing nuclear arsenals, this new doctrine creates a highly volatile, really fragile dynamic going forward. It's a profound strategic shift, and it absolutely continues to shape the geopolitics of South Asia to this day. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and I'll see you next time.